What remains of a man when he builds something he cannot inherit? The question does not announce itself with drama. It arrives quietly, the way fog settles over Lake Geneva in early morning, obscuring the shoreline until the world beyond disappears. If you find value in these explorations of architecture, legacy, and the families who shaped both, consider subscribing to the channel. We are building toward our first 1,000, and your presence here makes each investigation possible. On the 6th of July, 1960, the city of Geneva moved through an ordinary summer afternoon. The lake shimmered under a pale sun. Tourists walked the Quai du Mont Blanc, admiring window displays of precision instruments and gold cases behind polished glass. In the workshops along the Rue du Rhône, craftsmen bent over their benches, fitting hands to dials, calibrating movements measured in fractions of seconds. The name above those workshops had become synonymous with perfection itself. Rolex. A word recognized on every continent, worn by explorers descending into ocean trenches and climbers standing atop the world's highest peaks. The crown logo needed no translation, and somewhere in the residential hills above the city, in a private residence whose address few knew and fewer still had ever visited, Hans Wilsdorf lay dying. He was 78 years old. He had been in declining health for months, though the company's official communications mentioned nothing of illness. The man who had spent 5 decades constructing an empire of timekeeping left behind no public diary, no memoir, no authorized biography. His face appeared in almost no photographs from his later years. Those who worked closest to him described a figure of absolute discipline and deliberate obscurity, a man who seemed to understand, long before the end, that his survival depended on disappearing. The residence where he spent his final hours was not a palace. Geneva's wealthiest citizens did not build monuments to themselves in the manner of American industrialists or British aristocrats. The Swiss preference ran toward discretion, toward homes that revealed their quality only to those who understood what they were seeing. Wilsdorf had absorbed this sensibility completely after 4 decades in the city. His homes, and there were several over the years, each transition handled with the same secrecy that governed every aspect of his existence, were known primarily for what they did not display. No gates bearing family crests, no driveways designed to impress arriving guests, no visible staff in livery. What the properties did contain remains largely a matter of speculation. Wilsdorf granted no interviews about his domestic life. He permitted no journalists past his threshold. When he entertained, which was rarely, the guest lists were never published. The interiors of his residences existed in a space outside public record, known only to household employees, bound by discretion, and the occasional business associate whose visit warranted such intimacy. The official cause of death was recorded simply: natural causes, the failing of a body that had carried its owner through nearly 8 decades of relentless work. The funeral arrangements followed the pattern Wilsdorf had established throughout his life: private, minimal, closed to all but a small circle, whose names were never released to the press. No grand memorial service filled Geneva's cathedral. No procession of dignitaries wound through the streets. The man who had placed his watches on the wrists of kings and presidents departed the world with the same studied invisibility he had cultivated while living in it. But the silence surrounding his death only amplified the questions that had accumulated over a lifetime. Where had the fortune gone? The company he built was valued in figures that defied easy comprehension, yet Wilsdorf left no children, no direct heirs, no blood relatives positioned to inherit the empire. His wife, Florence, had died 16 years earlier, in 1944, and her passing had marked a turning point whose full significance would only become clear decades later. In the months following her death, Wilsdorf had begun restructuring everything, not merely his business, but his very relationship to ownership itself. The documents filed in Swiss registries during those years tell a story of systematic dissolution. The man was removing himself, piece by piece, from the entity he had created. By the time death found him in that quiet residence above the lake, Hans Wilsdorf owned almost nothing in his own name. The watches, the workshops, the patents, the properties, all of it had been transferred to a foundation, his foundation, bearing his name but belonging to no one. Outside the windows of that final residence, Geneva continued its precise and orderly existence. The workshops kept their schedules. The craftsmen completed their calibrations. The crown logo gleamed in shop windows across the world. And somewhere in the silence of an emptying house, the question hung unanswered. What remains of a man who builds something designed to outlast him, and then ensures he cannot pass it on? To understand what Hans Wilsdorf became, one must first consider what he lost. He was born on the 22nd of March, 1881, in the Bavarian city of Kulmbach. The town sat in the northern reaches of the region, surrounded by forested hills, and known primarily for its breweries. His father, Daniel Wilsdorf, was a hardware merchant, a man of modest prosperity, respected in local circles, comfortable enough to provide his children with education and stability. His mother, Anna Bruckmann, came from a family of similar standing. The household was orderly, traditional, unremarkable in its rhythms. Then, within the span of 12 months, both parents died. Hans was 12 years old. His brother and sister, equally young, were scattered among relatives. The family home was dissolved. The hardware business passed to other hands. Whatever inheritance existed was administered by guardians whose names survive only in legal documents. The boy who would one day control one of the world's most valuable companies learned before adolescence ended that security was an illusion, that everything solid could vanish, that the only protection against loss was to build something that could not be taken away. The guardians, recognizing some aptitude in the orphan, arranged for his education at a commercial boarding school in Coburg. The curriculum emphasized languages, accounting, and the practical skills required for international trade. Wilsdorf proved exceptional. By his late teens, he spoke German, English, and French with professional fluency. He understood bookkeeping, correspondence, the mechanics of import and export. But he had no capital, no family connections, no inheritance to leverage. What he possessed was discipline forged in absence, the understanding that he would have to construct his future from nothing. At 19, he took a position with a pearl and watch exporting firm in La Chaux-de-Fonds, in the Swiss Jura Mountains. The town was the heart of the Swiss watchmaking industry, a place where precision was not merely valued, but worshipped. Wilsdorf spent his days handling timepieces, learning their mechanisms, studying the difference between craftsmanship that endured and work that merely functioned. He absorbed everything: the grades of movement, the tolerances of escapements, the markets where Swiss quality commanded premium prices, and the markets where cheaper alternatives dominated. 3 years later, he moved to London. The city was then the commercial capital of the world, the hub through which goods flowed to every corner of the British Empire. Wilsdorf arrived with limited funds and unlimited ambition. He took a position with a watch importing firm, learning the English market from within. He observed how watches were sold, how they were marketed, how brand names influenced perception more than mechanical reality. The technical quality of a movement mattered less to most buyers than the name engraved on the dial. In 1905, at 24 years old, he made his move. With a partner named Alfred Davis, his future brother-in-law, Wilsdorf established a small firm called Wilsdorf and Davis. The company would import Swiss watch movements and fit them into cases for the English market. The operation began in a modest office at 83 Hatton Garden in London's jewellery district. The startup capital was minimal. The competition was fierce. Established firms controlled the trade, and a young German immigrant with no family name commanded little automatic respect. But Wilsdorf understood something his competitors had not yet grasped. The future belonged to the wristwatch. In 1905, serious men wore pocket watches. Wristwatches were considered jewelry for women, novelties unsuited to the demands of business or exploration. The movements available for wrist-worn cases were small, fragile, notoriously inaccurate. Wilsdorf ignored the conventional wisdom. He saw soldiers in the Boer War strapping watches to their wrists for convenience under fire. He saw a generation that would demand precision without the ritual of extracting a timepiece from a vest pocket. He saw the 20th century arriving, and he positioned himself to meet it. The name he chose for his watches came to him, according to his own account, while riding on the upper deck of a London omnibus. He wanted something short, pronounceable in any language, elegant when printed on a dial. He claimed to have tested every combination of letters in the alphabet. The word he settled on meant nothing in any language. Rolex, 5 letters, 2 syllables, a sound that suggested precision without specifying it. He registered the trademark in 1908. The crown logo followed, and from that cramped office in Hatton Garden, operating on margins so thin that a single failed shipment could have ended everything, Hans Wilsdorf began building an empire. The early years demanded sacrifices invisible to later admirers. Wilsdorf worked hours that left no time for leisure. He travelled constantly between London and Switzerland, negotiating with movement manufacturers, demanding tolerances that many considered impossible for small calibers. He married Florence Frances May Crotty in 1908, the same year he registered the Rolex name. She was English, the sister of his business partner, and she would remain beside him through the decades of building that followed. But a home of their own, a residence that reflected the success he was constructing, remained far in the future. The profits of those early years flowed back into the business. Every franc earned was reinvested in better movements, better cases, better marketing. Wilsdorf lived modestly while building immodestly. The contrast between his personal circumstances and his commercial ambitions grew wider with each passing year. Then the world changed, and Wilsdorf changed with it. The Great War arrived in 1914. And with it came validation Wilsdorf could never have purchased. Officers in the trenches needed timepieces they could read at a glance while coordinating artillery barrages. Pilots in open cockpits needed watches that would not fail at altitude. The wristwatch, dismissed a decade earlier as a feminine accessory, became essential military equipment. Wilsdorf had stockpiled inventory in anticipation of exactly this shift. While competitors scrambled to adapt, Rolex was already positioned to supply. But Wilsdorf sought something beyond wartime demand. He understood that the wristwatch's reputation for inaccuracy would return once peace arrived, and with it, the old prejudices. He needed proof, not advertising claims, but objective verification, that a small movement worn on the wrist could match the precision of the finest pocket chronometers. In 1914, he submitted a Rolex wristwatch to the Kew Observatory in England for testing. The observatory was then the supreme authority on timekeeping precision in the British Empire. Its certification process subjected movements to weeks of testing across multiple positions and temperatures. The standards had been designed for marine chronometers, the instruments upon which naval navigation depended. No wristwatch had ever passed. The Rolex movement received a Class A certificate. The designation had previously been reserved for the most accurate marine chronometers in existence. Wilsdorf had achieved, in a case small enough to strap around a wrist, what the greatest Swiss manufacturers had accomplished only in instruments the size of small clocks. He marketed the achievement relentlessly. Advertisements announced the Q certification in language that bordered on technical poetry. The message was clear. Rolex had transformed the wristwatch from a convenience into an instrument of precision. The war ensured demand. The certification ensured reputation. By 1919, when the armistice had settled into uneasy peace, Hans Wilsdorf was no longer a young immigrant struggling for recognition. He was a manufacturer whose name meant something. Yet England had grown complicated. The war had strained relations between Britain and Germany. Anti-German sentiment lingered, and Wilsdorf, despite his years in London, despite his English wife, despite the watches he had supplied to British officers, remained a German citizen. Import duties rose. The bureaucratic friction increased. The advantages that had drawn him to London were eroding. In 1919, he relocated the company to Geneva. The move was strategic in ways that extended beyond taxation. Geneva offered proximity to the Swiss workshops that supplied his movements. It offered political neutrality, a jurisdiction unlikely to be disrupted by the nationalist tensions reshaping Europe. And it offered something subtler, a culture of discretion that matched Wilsdorf's temperament. The Geneva bourgeoisie did not flaunt. They accumulated quietly, lived well without ostentation, and maintained the privacy that new wealth elsewhere often abandoned. Wilsdorf adapted to this environment with the thoroughness he brought to everything. His first Geneva residence was comfortable but unremarkable, a property suited to a successful businessman rather than an industrial titan. He learned the local customs, the social codes, the expectations governing how wealth should and should not be displayed. Florence, his wife, managed the household with efficiency that left him free to focus on expansion. They entertained selectively. They cultivated relationships with care. They revealed nothing that did not serve a purpose. The 1920s brought innovations that transformed Rolex from a prestigious brand into a cultural phenomenon. In 1926, Wilsdorf introduced the Oyster, the first truly waterproof wristwatch. The case was sealed with a revolutionary screw-down crown and case back, protecting the movement from moisture, dust, and pressure. To prove the claim, he arranged for a young English swimmer named Mercedes Gleitzer to wear an oyster around her neck during her attempt to cross the English Channel. She swam for more than 10 hours through frigid water. The watch emerged functioning perfectly. Wilsdorf purchased a full front-page advertisement in the Daily Mail announcing the triumph. The marketing was audacious, unprecedented, and devastatingly effective. 3 years later came the Perpetual, a self-winding movement that harnessed the motion of the wearer's wrist to maintain power. No manual winding required. The rotor technology would become standard across the industry, but Rolex held the patents. The combination of waterproofing and automatic winding created something new in the history of timekeeping, a precision instrument that required almost nothing from its owner except to be worn. The profits mounted, the reputation solidified, and Hans Wilsdorf, approaching 50, began to consider questions that had nothing to do with movements or marketing. He and Florence had no children. Whether by choice or circumstance, the records do not say, and Wilsdorf never addressed the matter publicly. But the absence shaped everything that followed. The empire he was building had no heir apparent, no son to train in the business, no daughter whose marriage might forge advantageous alliances. The fortune accumulating in Swiss accounts would pass, upon his death, to no one who shared his blood. For most men, this realization might have prompted withdrawal, a gradual disengagement from the relentless demands of growth. For Wilsdorf, It prompted the opposite. If he could not create a dynasty of descendants, he would create something else, a structure so resilient, so independent of any single human life, that it would continue long after the last person who remembered his face had died. The first signs of this transformation appeared in the 1930s. Wilsdorf began separating himself from direct ownership, establishing holding structures whose complexity required specialized legal counsel to navigate. The family home grew more comfortable, but no more visible. The man behind the crown logo retreated further into shadow. Then, in 1944, Florence died. The death was not unexpected. Florence had been ill, and the war years had made travel for specialized treatment difficult. But the loss struck Wilsdorf with a force that those who knew him only through business could not have anticipated. He was 63 years old. He had been married to her for 36 years. She had managed his homes, hosted his rare social obligations, provided the domestic stability that allowed him to pour every other resource into the company. Now she was gone, and the house fell silent. Within months of her death, Wilsdorf established the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation. The legal documents filed in Geneva described a charitable entity dedicated to supporting causes in education, social welfare, and the arts. The foundation would receive donations, manage investments, distribute grants to worthy recipients. On paper, it resembled dozens of similar structures created by wealthy Swiss families seeking to formalize their philanthropic commitments while enjoying favorable tax treatment. But Wilsdorf's foundation was different. Over the following years, he transferred to it not merely surplus wealth, but the entirety of Rolex itself. The company, its patents, its properties, its inventory, its brand would be owned by an entity that could never die, never divorce, never produce disappointing heirs. The foundation had no shareholders expecting dividends. It had no family members entitled to distributions. It existed solely to hold, to protect, and to perpetuate. The implications took years to become fully visible. In the immediate aftermath of Florence's death, Wilsdorf continued his work with the intensity that had characterized his entire career. The war had disrupted Swiss exports, but it had also created opportunities. Military contracts flowed to Geneva. The oyster's reputation for durability made it favored equipment for officers on both sides of the conflict. When peace returned in 1945, Rolex emerged stronger than before. The late 1940s and 1950s marked the apex of Wilsdorf's influence. The watches he produced became instruments of record-setting achievement. In 1953, a Rolex accompanied Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay to the summit of Everest. The same year, a specially designed deep-sea model descended with Auguste Piccard's bathyscaphe to depths exceeding 10,000 feet. The brand had become synonymous with human achievement at the extremes, the highest altitudes, the deepest oceans, the fastest speeds. Wilsdorf orchestrated each triumph with precision. He cultivated relationships with explorers, scientists, and athletes whose accomplishments would reflect glory onto the crown logo. He understood that a watch photographed on a mountaineer's wrist was worth more than 1,000 advertisements. The testimonials were genuine. The watches performed exactly as promised. But the selection of which achievements to sponsor revealed a strategic mind, operating decades ahead of modern brand management. His residences during this period reflected success without announcing it. The properties in Geneva's better neighborhoods were substantial, well-appointed, maintained by small staffs, whose discretion was absolute. Visitors who secured invitations, and they were few, reported interiors of quiet taste. Fine furniture, carefully chosen paintings, books in multiple languages lining study walls. Nothing that shouted, everything that whispered. Wilsdorf himself had become almost invisible. He granted no interviews. He attended no industry conferences. When Rolex required a public face, subordinates provided it. The founder remained in shadow, directing operations through memoranda and private meetings. His preferences communicated through layers of trusted employees. Photographs from his later decades are remarkably scarce. The man who had built one of the world's most recognized brands had succeeded in making himself unrecognizable. The daily routines of those years survive only in fragments. He rose early. He reviewed production reports with attention to details that subordinates found exhausting. He maintained correspondence in 3 languages, dictating letters whose formality never softened, regardless of the recipient. He ate simply. He did not drink to excess. He permitted himself few indulgences beyond the satisfaction of watching his creation grow. But growth brought complications he had not anticipated. The foundation structure, designed to ensure perpetuity, also ensured that Wilsdorf's control would eventually end. He could direct the entity while alive, but he could not govern it from the grave. The board members he appointed would someday appoint their own successors. The policies he established would someday be revised by people who had never met him. The company would continue, but it would continue without him. Not merely without his presence, but without his guidance, his judgment, his understanding of what Rolex was meant to be. The question that had haunted him since Florence's death grew sharper as the 1950s advanced. He had solved the problem of inheritance by eliminating inheritance entirely. He had ensured that no unworthy heir could dissipate what he had built. But in doing so, he had also ensured that no heir of any kind would carry forward his vision. The foundation would own Rolex. Rolex would endure. But Hans Wilsdorf, his memories, his instincts, his particular genius, would vanish as completely as if he had never existed. The homes he occupied in those final years were comfortable prisons of his own design. Staff moved through the rooms on silent schedules. Meals appeared and were consumed. Correspondence arrived and was answered. But the man at the center of it all had become a ghost, haunting his own life, present in body while already rehearsing his absence. What remains of a man who builds something he cannot inherit? Wilsdorf was beginning to learn. The silence of a house without children is different from other silences. Wilsdorf had lived with this particular quiet for decades, but in the years following Florence's death, its character changed. The absence was no longer shared. There was no one across the breakfast table, no voice calling from another room, no presence whose breathing could be heard in the stillness of evening. The staff maintained their routines, the cook preparing meals, the housekeeper managing linens, the gardener tending grounds that Wilsdorf rarely walked, but their movements only emphasized what was missing. They were employees, not companions. They departed at the end of their shifts to homes and families of their own. The properties themselves became repositories of accumulated habit. Wilsdorf kept certain chairs, certain tables, certain arrangements of objects that Florence had established. Whether from sentiment or simple reluctance to change, he preserved the domestic architecture she had created. Visitors noted that the residences felt inhabited by 2 people, even though only one remained. Her preferences lingered in the curtain fabrics, the placement of vases, the books left on particular shelves. He lived among her choices as though she might return to inspect them. His own contribution to the interiors was primarily absence. Wilsdorf displayed almost nothing related to Rolex within his homes. No trophy cases held commemorative timepieces. No photographs showed him shaking hands with the explorers and athletes whose achievements he had sponsored. The separation between professional triumph and private life was absolute, as though the 2 realms existed in different dimensions that must never intersect. This compartmentalization extended to his management of the company itself. By the mid-1950s, Rolex employed hundreds of workers across multiple facilities in Geneva. The workshops hummed with activity from early morning until evening. Master watchmakers trained apprentices in techniques passed down through generations. Quality control inspectors rejected movements that deviated by fractions of seconds from acceptable tolerances. The organization had grown far beyond what any single person could directly supervise, yet Wilsdorf attempted supervision nonetheless. He reviewed production figures daily. He demanded explanations for variations in output. He insisted on approving marketing materials personally, scrutinizing photographs and copy with the same attention he had once given to movement specifications. Subordinates learned to anticipate his questions, to prepare documentation that addressed concerns he had not yet voiced. The founder's shadow fell across every department, even when weeks passed without his physical presence in the workshops. The strain of this control manifested in ways he likely did not recognize. His correspondence from the period reveals a man increasingly preoccupied with details that subordinates considered trivial: the precise shade of green used in a dial, the angle at which a crown logo appeared in an advertisement, the phrasing of a single sentence in a press release. These were not the concerns of a leader confident in his organization. They were the anxieties of someone who sensed control slipping away and grasped at whatever remained within reach. His health, never robust in later years, began to falter. The specific ailments are not documented. Wilsdorf's medical privacy was as carefully guarded as every other aspect of his existence. But associates noted his increasing fatigue. Meetings grew shorter. Travel became rare. The man who had once moved constantly between London and Geneva, between suppliers and clients, between workshops and boardrooms, now rarely left the residential hills above the lake. The homes that had once hosted carefully curated gatherings fell quieter still. Invitations were declined. Social obligations were delegated to subordinates or simply ignored. Wilsdorf retreated into a circle that shrank with each passing year, until only a handful of trusted employees and advisors maintained regular contact. Yet the company flourished in direct proportion to its founder's withdrawal. The late 1950s brought record sales across every market. The waiting lists for certain models stretched into months. The crown logo had achieved something remarkable in the history of commerce. It had become simultaneously a symbol of exclusivity and a universal aspiration. Kings wore Rolex. So did successful merchants, ambitious professionals, military officers, and anyone else who wished to signal achievement without vulgarity. The paradox was complete. Wilsdorf had built an empire that no longer required his presence. The systems he had established functioned without his daily intervention. The reputation he had constructed sustained itself through momentum he had initiated decades earlier. He had made himself unnecessary to the very thing that had given his life meaning. In the quiet of his Geneva residence, surrounded by Florence's furnishings and his own accumulated solitude, Wilsdorf contemplated what would remain when he was gone. The foundation would continue. The company would continue. The watches would continue to measure time for generations he would never see. But the man himself, his memories, his sorrows, his particular way of understanding the world, would leave no trace. He had designed it so. The final years approached, and with them a reckoning he had spent a lifetime preparing for and dreading in equal measure. The year 1959 brought a winter that seemed reluctant to end. Geneva's lake reflected grey skies through February, through March, into an April that offered little warmth. In the residential hills above the city, Hans Wilsdorf observed the season's slowness from windows he increasingly rarely left. He was 78 years old. His body had begun failing in ways that no amount of discipline could reverse. The hands that had once examined watch movements with surgical precision now trembled when lifted. The eyes that had scrutinized dial colors and bezel alignments now strained against ordinary light. The household staff adjusted their routines to accommodate his diminishing capacities. Meals were simplified. Stairs were avoided. The portions of the residence he actually inhabited contracted to a few rooms: a bedroom, a sitting area, a study where correspondence accumulated in neat piles that grew faster than he could address them. The rest of the house stood maintained but unused, furniture covered against dust that would settle regardless, curtains drawn against light that no longer had a witness. His control over the company had become largely ceremonial. The board of the Heirs Foundation met without requiring his presence. Production decisions were made by managers who had learned to interpret his preferences without consulting him directly. Marketing campaigns launched bearing his implicit approval, but not his actual review. The organization had developed its own intelligence, its own momentum, its own capacity for self-direction. The founder had become an icon rather than a leader, revered, consulted on matters of symbolic importance, but no longer essential to daily operations. This transition, which Wilsdorf had himself designed, proved more painful than he had anticipated. He had spent 50 years building systems that would outlast him. He had structured ownership to eliminate the vulnerabilities of inheritance. He had trained subordinates to replicate his judgment. And now, watching his creation function without him, he confronted the success of his own planning. The company did not need him. Perhaps it had not needed him for years. Perhaps his continued involvement had been indulged rather than required, a courtesy extended to a founder whose usefulness had expired. The residences he had occupied throughout his Geneva decades stood as monuments to this obsolescence. The furnishings Florence had chosen remained in place, but their context had shifted. They were no longer the backdrop to a shared life, but artifacts of a life that had ended. The books on the study shelves would never be read again. The dining table that had hosted carefully selected guests would host no more gatherings. The gardens would continue their seasonal cycles for someone else's benefit or no one's at all. Wilsdorf had made provisions, of course. The properties would pass to the foundation upon his death, to be maintained or sold according to the board's judgment. The personal effects would be disposed of discreetly. The papers and correspondence would be archived or destroyed. He left instructions, though their specifics remain confidential. Nothing would be left to chance. Nothing would be left to sentiment. The same precision that had governed his business would govern his dissolution. But precision could not address the questions that surfaced in the long hours between waking and sleeping. What had it meant? The decades of labor, the innovations, the triumphs. What had they amounted to, if not a legacy that would pass to strangers? He had no child to remember him as a father. He had no grandchild to inherit stories of his struggles and successes. The employees who had worked beside him would retire and die. The associates who had witnessed his achievements would follow. Within a generation, perhaps two, no living person would possess a genuine memory of Hans Wilsdorf. He would become a name in corporate histories, a signature on archived documents, a face in photographs that grew rarer with each passing decade. The foundation would speak of him in institutional terms. The company would honor him in ways designed to enhance brand value. But the man himself, the orphan from Kulmbach, the immigrant in London, the husband who had loved a woman named Florence for 36 years, would vanish as completely as his parents had vanished from his own childhood. Spring arrived late that year, but it arrived. The grey skies lifted. The lake recovered its blue. In the workshops along the Rue du Rhône, craftsmen continued their calibrations, fitting hands to dials, assembling movements whose precision Wilsdorf had made possible. The crown logo gleamed in shop windows across the world, indifferent to the mortality of the man who had designed it. Wilsdorf received visitors occasionally, board members seeking formal approval, old associates paying respects that felt increasingly valedictory. He received them in the sitting room, dressed carefully despite the effort it required, maintaining the dignity that had characterized his public persona for half a century. The conversations were brief. The topics were carefully circumscribed. No one spoke of endings, though everyone present understood what was approaching. The summer of 1960 arrived with warmth that Wilsdorf could feel but not enjoy. His condition had deteriorated through the spring. The doctors who attended him, their names, like so much else, remain private, could offer comfort but not recovery. The body that had carried him through nearly 8 decades of relentless effort was concluding its operations, shutting down systems one by one with the same methodical precision its owner had brought to everything. On the 6th of July, in the quiet of a residence that had sheltered his solitude for years, Hans Wilsdorf died. The foundation announced the death with restraint, appropriate to its subject. The funeral arrangements proceeded according to instructions left long in advance. And in Geneva, in workshops and offices and boutiques bearing the crown logo, the machinery of perpetuity continued without interruption. Time, as always, moved forward. The watches kept measuring it. The man who had built them was gone. The residences Hans Wilsdorf occupied in Geneva do not appear on tourist maps. There are no plaques marking where the founder of Rolex lived, no museum preserving the rooms where he took his meals or reviewed his correspondence. The properties passed to the foundation upon his death, as he had arranged, and the foundation disposed of them with the same discretion that had governed their original acquisition. Some were sold to private buyers, who valued anonymity as much as Wilsdorf had. Others were repurposed for institutional use, their domestic histories erased by renovation. The specific addresses have faded from public memory, known only to archivists and the occasional researcher, persistent enough to excavate property records from decades past. This erasure was not accidental. Wilsdorf left no instructions requesting commemoration. He endowed no chairs at universities, commissioned no statues, established no prizes bearing his name beyond the foundation itself. The man who had spent 50 years building one of the most recognized brands in human history made no effort to build recognition for himself. The asymmetry was deliberate, perhaps the most revealing decision of his entire career. The Heirs Wilsdorf Foundation continues to operate from Geneva, its activities shielded by Swiss privacy laws and its own institutional preference for silence. The foundation owns Rolex entirely. It distributes the company's considerable profits to charitable causes, whose selection follows criteria known only to the board. No annual report details the disbursements. No public accounting reveals where the money flows. The foundation functions as Wilsdorf designed it, autonomous, perpetual, opaque. Rolex itself has grown beyond anything its founder could have envisioned. The company produces approximately 1 million watches per year, each one commanding prices that would have seemed fantastical in Wilsdorf's lifetime. The waiting lists for certain models stretch into years. The secondary market trades timepieces at multiples of their retail value. The crown logo has become a universal symbol of achievement, recognized in every country, coveted across every social stratum that can aspire to ownership. Yet the company maintains the discretion Wilsdorf established. No Rolex executive gives interviews discussing strategy. No factory tour admits journalists or photographers. The manufacturing facilities in Geneva and elsewhere operate behind security that rivals military installations. The organization has absorbed its founder's temperament so completely that his personal invisibility has become corporate policy. What remains of Hans Wilsdorf? The question he embodied has no simple answer. His bloodline ended with him. No descendant carries his genetic material into future generations. No grandchild hears stories of the orphan who built an empire. The family name continues, only because he affixed it to a foundation, an institution, not a lineage. His possessions dispersed after death. The furnishings Florence chose, the books he accumulated, the personal effects of 8 decades, all distributed, sold or discarded, according to instructions that prioritized efficiency over sentiment. No collection preserves his belongings. No auction has offered items from his estate. His image survives in a handful of photographs, most from his middle decades, none revealing much beyond formal posture and careful grooming. The face is unremarkable, a European businessman of his era, indistinguishable from thousands of similar men in similar photographs. Nothing in the eyes hints at the empire behind them. What remains is the work itself. The watches keep time on wrists across the world, measuring moments for people who will never know the name of the orphan from Kulmbach. The crown logo gleams in cities he never visited, cultures he never encountered,